Imagine you were 5 minutes late to a shift in 2024.
Just a completely minor thing.
Right, exactly. And you apologized, you fixed your alarm clock, and from that day forward, you became an absolute model employee.
A perfect record since then.
Yeah. But then, fast forward to 2026. Your company announces widespread layoffs, and you are the very first person fired.
Oh, wow.
And why? Because of that one morning 2 years ago.
It sounds absurd, but it's actually happening.
It really is. Today, we're looking at this deeply troubling, highly documented trend in human resources that is, frankly, fundamentally changing how companies handle discipline.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, we're seeing a massive shift right now. It's driven largely by economic tightening, corporate restructuring, that sort of thing.
Right, companies are feeling the squeeze.
Exactly. So employers are quietly extending the lifespan of disciplinary warnings. Like the conventional standard in the UK was always 6 to 12 months.
Which makes sense. A reasonable time to prove you've improved.
Right. But now companies are aggressively writing 18 or even 24-month warning durations into their internal policies.
24 months. There's 2 whole years for one mistake.
Yeah, they claim this is to manage what they call long-tail performance issues. But the data and, honestly, the case law suggest something much more strategic is happening behind closed doors.
And that is exactly what we're going to unpack. We have a massive stack of sources for today's deep dive. Employment tribunal case summaries, statutory ACAS guidance, and legal analyses from major HR bodies.
It's a lot of dense material.
It is. But our mission today is to explain to you exactly how this 24-month trend works, the legal battleground it's created, and how a seemingly dormant warning from years ago can suddenly threaten your livelihood today.
It's a scary prospect, and to understand why companies want these warnings to last longer, we really have to look at the mechanics of a company layoff.
Okay, let's get into it.
Right, so in UK employment law, when a company needs to make redundancies, they can't just pick names out of a hat.
Obviously not yet.
They are legally required to use a selection matrix.
A matrix, like a spreadsheet.
Basically, yeah. It functions as a scoring spreadsheet where every employee in a specific pool is graded against their peers on various criteria.
Like what kind of criteria?
Things like skills, attendance, general performance.
Got it. And I saw in the sources there's a pretty major case from 1995, British Aerospace v. Green.
Yes, a landmark case.
Right, and that really sets the stage for how these matrices are built.
Yeah.
The Employment Appeal Tribunal decided that employers need objective ways to select people for redundancy.
To avoid managers just firing based on subjective feelings or, personal biases.
Exactly. So the court established that employers are fully allowed to use disciplinary history as an objective criterion.
And that ruling, while totally logical at the time, paved the way for the current math problem we're seeing.
That problem.
Yeah, because provided an employer applies the disciplinary criteria consistently across the board, tribunals generally won't interfere with the matrix. But companies have weaponized this by using what is known as reverse scoring or heavy percentage deductions. This is where the damage actually happens.
Okay, let's ground this in reality for a second. Let's say we have a hypothetical employee, Sarah from accounting.
Okay, Sarah.
Sarah's a top performer. Now, in a typical redundancy matrix, a completely clean record might earn her, say, 10 points.
Right, full marks.
But if Sarah has a live first written warning, that score plummets to 4 points.
A huge drop.
And if she has a live final warning, she gets just 1 point. And some companies don't even bother with points.
Yeah, exactly. Some just apply a flat 25% reduction to your total overall score.
Across every single category.
Across everything, just because of that one warning.
That is brutal.
It is. That flat reduction virtually guarantees you lose to a mediocre employee who just happens to have a clean record.
Wow.
Because under the traditional 12-month policy, if Sarah got a warning in January, by the following January, it expires.
Right, it's wiped clean.
So if a redundancy happens 18 months later, she scores maximum points because she's had a clean record for 6 months.
Makes sense.
But under this new 24-month trend, her 18 months of perfect behavior still leaves her at the absolute bottom of the scoring pool.
Because that warning is technically still live.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. So essentially, if I'm understanding this math right, a 24-month warning means your career's health bar is basically stuck at 1% for 2 full years.
That's a great way to put it.
Right, like a video game.
Yeah.
Even if you've been a model employee playing the game perfectly that whole time, the moment the redundancy boss appears, you're the first one knocked out. How is that fair?
It's incredibly punitive, and honestly, it forces us to ask who actually dictates the lifespan of these warnings in the first place.
Yeah, who's making these rules?
The answer lies in this weird gap between statutory law and corporate discretion.
Wait, I'm confused. Because ACAS, the Advisory Conciliation and Arbitration Service, they're the government body that sets the baseline for workplace disputes in the UK, right?
They are, yes.
So wouldn't they just enforce a strict limit? Like, how can an employer just decide to double the lifespan of a warning on their own?
And that is the exact loophole employers are exploiting.
Oh, really?
Yeah. If we look closely at the ACUS Code of Practice, specifically paragraph 19, which is the statutory guidance,
Okay.
it outlines that an employer is legally required to tell an employee the period for which a warning will remain live.
Okay, so they have to inform you.
Right. But crucially, paragraph 19 does not enforce a hard statutory limit on what that duration can actually be.
Wait, statutory means tribunals legally must take it into account when deciding a case, right?
Yes, exactly.
So the legally binding document just says you have to tell them, but it doesn't say it can only be 6 months or 12 months.
Exactly that. There is no hard cap. Now, ACUS does publish separate non-statutory guidance.
Okay, non-statutory.
Yeah, and in that best practice guide, they strongly suggest that a first written warning should usually last 6 months, and a final written warning should last 12 months.
Which is the convention everyone knows.
Right, it's been the accepted convention for decades. But because it is non-statutory, employers essentially treat it as a suggestion rather than a rule.
A suggestion they can just ignore.
Pretty much.
And that brings us to a massive legal precedent from 2013, the case of Wincanton Group PCV Stone. Because looking at this case, it seems to just completely override that ACAS recommendation.
It absolutely shifted the landscape.
Right. The Employment Appeal Tribunal ruled that there is no statutory maximum for a warning. And the underlying legal logic was that tribunals shouldn't substitute their own judgment for that of a manager.
Right, they don't want to micromanage businesses.
Exactly. So employers have the discretion to set 24-month warnings, provided they act, quote, reasonably and proportionately.
Yes, and the word reasonably is doing a tremendous amount of heavy lifting there.
It really is. Because if Wincanton essentially says, do what you want as long as it's reasonable, isn't that just a massive legal loophole?
It definitely looks like one.
I mean, it sounds like companies are using this discretion as a stealthy way to pre-pack the redundancy pool with, highly disposable employees.
Well, it would be a complete blank check, except for how the courts actually define that reasonableness.
Okay. How do they define it?
What's fascinating here is the Section 98.4 reasonableness test. That's under the Employment Rights Act, 1996.
Okay, 98.4. What does that test do?
When a tribunal applies this test, they look at whether the punishment truly fits the crime, given the size and administrative resources of the employer. They examine the equity and the substantial merits of the entire case.
So they do look at the context.
Heavily.
Uh-huh.
In fact, legal analysts from major bodies like the CIPD and law firms like Lewis Silkin, they are issuing massive risk warnings to companies right now.
Really? Why?
Because a 24-month warning for a minor conduct issue, like our earlier example of being 5 minutes late, that categorically fails the Section 98.4 test.
Oh, okay. So the courts will step in if a company is just being ridiculous about it.
Exactly.
So for a 24-month warning to actually pass that 98 test and be legally proportionate, the original offense has to sit just like millimeters away from outright dismissal.
Right. We are talking about severe gross misconduct where the employer is essentially offering one absolute last chance.
Got it. It's not for being a few minutes late.
No. But despite that, we are seeing a spike in litigation anyway.
Because companies are trying to push it.
Yes. They're trying to apply these severe 24-month durations to minor long-tail performance issues anyway. And when they do that, we enter the territory of what employment lawyers call zombie warnings.
The zombie warnings and the sunset clause debate, right?
Yes, exactly.
Let's define a sunset clause for a second. It's simply the expiration date of a warning.
The date it drops off your record.
Right. The moment the sun sets on that timeline, the warning is supposed to be dead and buried. But employers are playing games with these dates. And there are two pivotal cases that show what happens when tribunals catch them doing this. There's Diosynth, Ltd v. Thompson from 2006, and Garden v. Axon Automotive Ltd from 2022.
Let's start with Diosynth. This case is highly persuasive because it actually went to the Court of Session in Scotland.
Okay, what happened?
The employer had an employee with an active warning, and just days before that first warning was set to expire.
Literally right before the sunset clause hit.
Literally right before. The employer issued a second warning for a completely different issue, and then they aggregated the two warnings to justify a full dismissal.
So they literally waited until the clock was almost out to tack on a new charge, just so they could finally fire him.
That's exactly how the court saw it, too. They looked at the timeline and determined that extending a warning or issuing a new one solely to keep an employee alive for disciplinary action was fundamentally unfair.
Yeah, it feels like cheating.
It is. The court said it basically constituted a form of double jeopardy.
Double jeopardy.
Right. They stated that long warning durations must be justified by the severity of the actual offense, not by some management desire to keep a permanent marker on an employee.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if I can't be tried twice for the same crime in a criminal court, an employer cannot legally revive a dying warning, a zombie warning, just to finally push me out the door.
Exactly.
And the Godden case in 2022 really reinforces how fragile this strategy is for employers, doesn't it?
It does. Godden illustrates the domino effect of these extensions.
What do you mean by domino effect?
Well, in that case, the employer relied on a previously extended warning to justify a final third strike dismissal.
Okay.
But the tribunal scrutinized the timeline and found that the earlier extension of the warning was unfair. So because that foundational warning was invalid, it invalidated the entire subsequent dismissal.
Oh, wow. So the whole house of cards collapsed.
Completely. Tribunals will scrutinize the fairness of the initial warning, even if it has technically expired, provided it forms part of the chain leading to a termination.
But wait, practically speaking, how does a judge sitting in a tribunal actually tell the difference?
What do you mean?
Like, how do they know if an employer's 24-month warning was a genuine response to a severe issue, or if the company was just, trying to keep the employee on a leash for an upcoming redundancy?
Yeah. The key differentiator there is the documentation standard.
Documentation.
Tribunals demand an incredibly strict audit trail. If an employer wants to defend an 18 or 24-month warning, they must document their logic at the exact time of the offense.
They can't just retroactively justify it.
No, they have to prove, in writing right then, why the severity of that specific action justified departing from the standard 6 to 12-month ACUS baseline.
Meaning a company cannot just quietly update their employee handbook to say, hey, all final warnings now last 24 months.
No, a blanket policy like that will fail the Section 98.4 reasonables test immediately because it completely lacks proportionality.
Makes total sense.
Furthermore, the employer must have a clean audit trail proving consistency across their entire workforce. You cannot give a 24-month warning to one person and a 6-month warning to another person for the exact same offense.
And that demand for consistency brings us to what the HR industry commentary highlights as arguably the most insidious part of this entire trend.
Yes, the structural issues.
Right. When managers are handed this much discretion over the lifespan of a warning, you open a massive blind spot for structural discrimination.
It's a huge risk factor.
Because the danger of a 24-month warning isn't just about unfair dismissal for the general workforce. It acts as a targeted structural trap for specific vulnerable groups.
Particularly disabled and neurodivergent employees. The statistical correlation here is deeply concerning.
Let's dig into that. Why is that the case?
We have to look at what kinds of workplace behaviors typically attract these minor disciplinary markers in the first place. Often, they're categorized by managers as issues with attendance, focus, or communication styles.
Right. So let's bring back our hypothetical employee, Sarah. Let's say Sarah has ADHD,
Okay.
which heavily impacts executive function and time blindness, right? Or perhaps she has an anxiety disorder that affects her communication style under pressure.
Both very common.
Statistically, she is going to attract more of these specific disciplinary markers than a neurotypical employee.
Yes. And under the old system, a 6-month warning for being late would expire relatively quickly, giving Sarah time to recalibrate.
She could recover.
Exactly. But extending these specific types of warnings to 18 or 24 months keeps a structural barrier in place disproportionately longer for these individuals.
Just hanging over her head.
It creates a systemic failure in the employment life cycle because under UK law, employers are required to make reasonable adjustments for disabled employees.
So what does this all mean? It sounds like if a company fails to make an upstream workplace adjustment, like, say, allowing Sarah flexible start times to accommodate her ADHD, that failure directly leads to a disciplinary warning for lateness. And because that warning now lasts for 2 full years, it basically transforms a simple lack of accommodation into a slow-motion firing mechanism.
That is exactly what is happening.
So is this 24-month trend actually just institutional bias disguised as performance management?
This raises an important question, and it's exactly what tribunals are now targeting. They are utilizing a specific framework to ensure structured fairness, specifically the NWAFF logic.
NWAF. What does that stand for?
It stands for the Neurodivergent Workplace Adjustment Framework.
Okay, how does the court use that?
Courts use this framework to explicitly trace the timeline of an employee's history. They want to know, did a lack of reasonable adjustment cause the warning to be issued in the first place?
And if it did?
If the root cause was the company's failure to support the employee, the 24-month warning is fundamentally invalid. Furthermore, the discrimination risk of inconsistency here is astronomical. Let's look at a scenario. Imagine Manager X doesn't understand ADHD. He gets frustrated with Sarah and decides to use his Wincanton discretion to issue an 18-month warning for poor attendance.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Manager Y, in a completely different department, gives a neurotypical employee the standard ACAS 6-month warning for the exact same attendance issue.
Okay, so they're totally inconsistent.
Right. Now, fast forward. When the company decides to do layoffs 2 years later, they pull everybody's files for the redundancy matrix.
And there's Sarah's live 18-month warning?
Yes. They see Sarah's live warning, they apply the 25% penalty, and she loses her job. She is selected for redundancy simply because her manager chose a longer sunset clause than Manager Y.
That is wild.
That scenario compounds the initial bias and transforms a single manager's frustration into a company-wide statistical disparity.
It becomes baked into the math.
It does. And it exposes the entire organization to massive systemic discrimination claims. Because the redundancy criteria, while appearing objective on a spreadsheet,
Right, it looks fair on paper.
exactly, it looks fair, but it's built on a foundation of discriminatory discipline.
It really shows how a tiny administrative decision, just changing a 12 to a 24 in an HR file, can completely alter the trajectory of someone's life.
It's a huge hidden risk for employees right now.
Well, let's wrap this up, because what we've uncovered in these sources today is pretty staggering. The era of the simple 6-month slap on the wrist is fading.
It really is.
Extended 18 to 24-month warnings are becoming these long-tail markers. They sit quietly in your file, acting as a delayed action trigger that can push you right out the door the second a redundancy spreadsheet is drawn up.
But the counterbalance is that the law is pushing back.
Right.
Tribunals demand that these extended warnings be heavily documented at the time they're issued. They must be proportionate to the offense and perfectly consistent across the entire organization.
And if they fail on any of those fronts,
They can, and they absolutely will be challenged.
and that is exactly why this knowledge is power for you, the listener. If you are ever handed a disciplinary warning, you cannot just accept it, put your head down, and hope it goes away.
No, that's the worst thing you can do.
You need to know that you can, and you should, challenge the duration of a warning the very moment it is issued to you. If your employer hands you a 24-month warning for a minor infraction, you have to ask for the documented Section 98.4 justification right then and there.
Exactly. Proactivity and demanding an audit trail at step 1 is your absolute best defense against a system that is increasingly designed to play the long game.
Do not wait until a redundancy matrix makes it a fatal issue 2 years down the line, because by then, the trap is already sprung.
It's too late by then.
Which leaves us with one final lingering question to ponder long after this deep dive ends. Think back to that 5-minute lateness we talked about at the very beginning.
Yeah.
If companies are systematically stretching disciplinary warnings to 24 months just to have an easier time legally selecting people for future redundancies, are these warnings no longer about correcting your behavior, which is supposed to be the entire point of discipline?
Right.
And instead, are they just a legally sanctioned method of predictive profiling for future layoffs? Watch your health bars out there.